afternoon, everyone. So welcome to the panel debate. We've got a panel of three from the plus Mark and myself from this week's conference. So we've got Chloe Davies from TfL. We've got Andy Mabbott from Pigs on the Wing, who's got geospatial background, and John Murray from University of Liverpool and various other areas with a spatial data background. We may also be joined by a couple of other speakers who might be delayed in previous meetings, but we'll start with the people that we've got. So first question really from me, and I'll sort of nudge them in different directions to different people, and we'll just work it from there. So one of the things I'm keen to understand really, and just be interested in just getting different thoughts from you that we've had across the week really, is what you think maybe the general direction and the big trends are for open data, and sort of looking forward, where do you think open data might be going into the future? Maybe if we start with John, go to Chloe and then Andy. So John, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, as I've mentioned in my talk, I'm a big supporter of the Geospatial Commission. I think I had input into it before it started. I think it's a really good step, and I'm actually talking to governments in other countries who are interested in doing similar and learning from it. The idea that you make your geospatial infrastructure available as an asset to the country. And they work very closely. I'm also working very closely with the Office for AI, as I showed in the case study. They've taken a great deal of interest because it's a big crossover between AI and open data, particularly when you're starting to get satellite imagery. So yeah, I see that. I mean, obviously I'm biased because my background's geospatial, but that's where I see the major growth in helping climate change, in transport, in services, in demography, healthcare. It's crosses the board of everything. Everything has a geospatial context.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, John. Chloe, what are your thoughts about long-term trends that we've got?
So I think I can really only speak with the sort of transport hat on. And I suppose two of the things that I've seen in my, not that long, but sort of year or two in this role is more about expansion. So more and more people, more and more organisations and transport networks want to make data open. And so certainly they've come to TfL as people that have been doing it for some time to ask for advice. And that's not necessarily just in public transport, excuse me, but also, we've had conversations with people who run sort of road networks and the likes of that, and people from different countries as well as other parts of the UK. So there's definitely a drive towards kind of more sort of transport and transit data coming there. I think there's going to be more standardization. So that gets driven by, Google are obviously a really big player with Google Maps and their GTFS, and now they have the GBFS for bikes as well. So I think that, more and more where before you kind of might have to sort of create your own standard, I think there'll be things that can be sort of plugged into, and that can only be a good thing for sort of making data reusable, or particularly when you look at things like micromobility, where you'll get players that are international, and certainly not just wearing my own hat from London. It makes it much easier for that data to then be shared if it's in a standard format. And the last thing I suppose kind of crosses over a little bit with what John was saying, which is around ancillary data. So we've got that kind of core data that is about timetables and arrivals and disruption. That's sort of how the network works. But I think increasingly people want to make their decisions based on more environmental factors. So I think getting data that supports that around air quality, integrating things like weather, the availability of parking and electric vehicle charging will become more and more important as we move forward. So it's not just about getting from A to B, but it's the data that goes around that, quietest journey, cheapest journey, stuff like that.
Yeah, and interesting, that EV charging question was one that came up this morning with Catherine Corrick, in that some of these are quite complex questions where you have to bring in data from multiple organisations to actually come up with an answer, otherwise you get nowhere. Yeah. John's waving away there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Chloe said. Actually, it's very relevant. So one of our students in the Geographic Data Science Labs has been working on on a TfL project. Actually, this is an ancillary one, a very good example. It's looking at Crossrail, but looking at satellite imagery and what is the impact on, and it's a long-term project. So taking a time series, capturing satellite imagery, what's happening around the stations, what's happening to developments. So it's looking more at the built environment and the what's happening with demography around stations. So what is the socio-economic impact of Crossrail? So that's a great example of where the two come together.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So Andy, any thoughts from you in terms of these longer term trends?
Yeah, well, John and Chloe have covered a lot of ground there, and I don't disagree with anything they've said. Obviously, geospatial is a major area and certainly one of the most attractive for me and a lot of other people, and one of the most important culturally and in terms of economics. So you know, whether you're interested in learning about Stone Age barrows or whether you want to plan journeys and decide where to build your hypermarket, it's relevant. So it cuts across a lot of different sectors. And similarly, transportation data is important. I think one aspect that interests me about this is the three sectors. So you have the public sector, who are very much mixed in terms of their embracing of open data and openness generally. Obviously, some of it's related to politics. So if you have a government who are interested in scrutiny and accountability, they're more likely to release open data than a government who aren't. I'm not pointing any fingers at anybody. You can draw your own conclusions. And also, of course, as an ancillary thing there, the public sector in terms of government and politicians are the people who can mandate openness of data from people like energy companies and water companies and transport companies and others. Then you've got the private sector. Private sector are very much interested in using open data. So you'll find Google scooping up transport data from other people and then using it in journey planning and so on as a product that they then use to sell advertising. But the private sector, of course, can also publish open data, and some of them are better than others. And thirdly, you have the voluntary sector. Obviously, I was speaking about OpenStreetMap on Wednesday, and I mentioned Wikidata. So if the public and the private sector aren't going to open up the data that we want, we have it available to us to create our own databases and to source our own versions of open data. And that's what we're doing in the UK with the address file that we're building up within OpenStreetMap for publicly available, freely available addressing data. I also think electronic vehicle charging points are an interesting thing. If there's a personal anecdote, the very first open data I published back in about 2009, 2010, when I was working for Birmingham City Council managing the website, we had 6 EV charging points, and I put a CSV file with their coordinates and street addresses and the operator names onto the website, purely so I could tick a box and say, yes, we've published some open data. It was probably the smallest open data publication anybody's ever done, but it was the first for Birmingham City Council.
Interesting you mentioned there about the idea about ticking boxes. I think it's probably start moving on to another theme before I hand over to Mark, but how much do you think there's a risk where people are just going to be doing open data as a tick box activity rather than actually fully embracing the spirit and what it might deliver for people?
Well, if you're asking me, I think there is a danger of that. I mean, obviously, I was being flippant when I referred to how we did it. It was just a bit of fun and a proof of concept. But yes, there is a danger of that. And I think Chloe's comment about standards touches on that really, or is relevant to it, in that if you're embracing open data, you will look into what the standards are. You will reuse existing standards. If you're going to be publishing address data, you'll break down the components of the address granularly into the things that match things like the iCard or vCard standard for transmitting address data. If you're not interested in embracing open data and you're just ticking a box, you will just put stuff online in the least accessible format possible. We've seen people publishing PDFs in response to freedom of information requests. We've seen people publishing spreadsheets with more than one data field munged into one spreadsheet or CSV column, and it's a sign of bad will, really, or certainly a sign of ignorance if you're assuming good faith.
Okay, great. Oops. Shall I move on to the next topic? I think there's some fascinating answers there in terms of long-term trends. But I think the next question really is in terms of possibly rather than looking forward, looking back a little bit and in terms of what we've learned. You know, and not long ago, when I think Andy, you were talking about publishing CSV as a tick boxing exercise. When I think we could say that open data used to be something of a novelty or something of an exception. Has it maybe now moved on to business as usual? And there's an expectation in many organisations that there's an absolute minimum of what they should be publishing as open data, and maybe the quality. Is it? Would you say it's moved into the mainstream business as usual? And we'll mix the order up a bit here. We'll go Chloe first, then Andy, and then John.
So again, I can only really speak with the TfL hat on, and it definitely feels like business as usual for us. It's something that we made a commitment to like way before I joined the organisation, and it's been a very sort of central part of our sort of digital strategy for a number of years. I think maybe even touching on what Andy was saying earlier, there's almost a question not as a tick box exercise, but almost as that commitment to open data like comes through to almost, we should publish everything. And actually one of the things that I'm interested in is questioning the actual value of it. And I obviously don't mean a monetary value, but I mean, is this something that is going to be used? Is it something that's going to be properly maintained? And therefore be a useful long running data set? Or is it something where because we've got it and we think we should put it up, it goes up and kind of gets forgotten about? And I think that's the kind of data governance thing that I talked about a little bit in my presentation the other day. So I think it's less about tick boxing and more about making sure that there is value to what we're doing.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think that's Andy, then John.
Yeah, I think it's very much a curate's egg. There is good and bad practice in all the three sectors that I mentioned, and certainly varying pictures internationally. So some organisations are doing this because they have to, because of statutory requirements. Some organisations aren't doing it, and some are doing it because they see benefit in it, either to them or to the wider community. One of my experiences as a consumer of open data is trying to get museums and galleries to give us data about what's in their collections. And it really goes from one extreme to the other. You get people who won't talk to you, people who will prevaricate and obstruct freedom of information requests until the last possible minute. And in some cases, we've had to go to the commissioner to get information out of people. And we get people who are proactively publishing and regularly updating data about what's in their collection, and going out and talking about why they're doing it and advocating it as a good thing to do. So I don't think you can say that there is any one state across the sector or the industry, if we can call it an industry. I think it's very much patchy.
Great, thanks, Andy. Before we go to John, I'd just like to welcome Alex Luck to the panel, and just give you a warning, Alex, the question we're discussing at the moment is, has open data moved from a novelty or a tick box exercise to very much business as usual? While John is giving his answer, you might want to have a think about what you'd like to say.
Yeah, I think one thing that's actually happened with the COVID pandemic is open data for good has come out. I mean, we've been involved in a number of projects, and I've seen other projects similar elsewhere. We were Liverpool was chosen as the initial mass testing pilot, you may recall. And one of the issues we had was we wanted to get everybody, and this is crossing into your area, Chloe, we wanted to put the testing stations where they were most accessible. So we had the transport network. We ran some graph analytics on the transport network, but we overlaid on that ONS data, so we knew where elderly and vulnerable people were, so they had to travel minimum distance. So it was actually a graph analytics problem on the transport network to decide the optimal locations for the COVID testing centre, where they were near buses or railway stations and near communities. So it really brought it out. That's one example. I've seen others. There's actually OS Open Roads used to track the epidemic spread. So and the rail network, how is transport affecting the spread of COVID? That was an area. Another thing which it actually was not related, but something you may have seen it in the media, but I can post a link. We had, where I live up in Chester, we had extremely heavy flooding in 2020 and 2021. the River Dee burst its banks, very considerable flooding south of Chester and then down towards Llangollen, and then also on the Severn around Shrewsbury, very heavy flooding. I actually know the local resilience forum chair very well, but they had a problem. Normally they would get helicopters up and they'd monitor the floodplains. The cloud was so low and dense they couldn't get the helicopters up. So John came to me and he said, look, can you help us? We can get drones up, but they're not high enough to get an overview because we've just got such large amounts of flooded area. So I actually used the Sentinel radar data, and it was really done a bit on the fly to test if it would work. But we actually used radar data and generated pseudo color imagery from radar that enabled them to see how the floodplain was behaving and actually allowed them to target where to put the resources, particularly in the 2021 flood event. It was particularly serious because the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine factory is in Wrexham, and basically had to get the army in to sandbag that around it because the floodwaters lapped up to it. It's on Wrexham Industrial Estate. So that was a particular area we were watching, but it didn't lose any production. So I think that sometimes disasters, and this can be elsewhere in the world, natural disasters in other countries, open data really comes to the fore. Unmapped areas in third world countries, generating maps from satellite imagery in the event of a disaster in a changing environment, if you've got an earthquake or something like that. So some monitoring. Climate change is another one where open data, the Met Office make their data open, satellite imagery again, various sources, all the models that have been worked on for climate change are publicly available as open data and open source code. So there's a lot that can be done in open data for good.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, John. Okay, Alex, hopefully you've got a sense of the topics in the conversation. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I think John's right that you do tend to see this real uptick in the availability of data when there's a disaster, and I mean COVID's been a prime example of that. Is that people are much more enthusiastic about sharing information and could see why they should do so. I think the tendency always is, once that situation is past, is that the enthusiasm wanes, and people start to think about, well, actually, do I want to release that information? So I think, we talk about sort of open or closed data, and I think it's a more complex picture than that, because there are other times when there is great use for sharing information that we wouldn't necessarily make totally open, but would need to be made available to certain people for good reason. So I think we need to think about it in that context as well. And clearly, with my sort of security perspective on that's something I would really encourage, because the tendency is if we chuck everything out there, that we're actually revealing more and actually potentially creating harm as well as potential benefit. So I think it's always a question about taking that, and I was talking about this yesterday, this sort of appropriate and proportionate response to what we release, and weighing up the benefit of releasing information versus the disbenefit or the security implications that we need to take into consideration about not releasing that information. And I think also, we talk about just, well, let's make everything open, let's put as much as we can out there in the hopes that, people are going to make, huge amounts of, drive huge amounts of value out of it. And I think, maybe that's a slight misconception. I mean, there's a lot that said, that the vast majority of information that's made open is that really people don't use it particularly. So I think it's always a bit of a balance, and I think we maybe need to take a slightly more thoughtful process of it, go through a very slightly more thoughtful process about what we make and what we make open and what we don't.
Yeah, I think it sounds like you're making the case that actually it's a level of an indication of maturity, that you are consciously deciding what to publish as open data and why, and you know, it's sufficiently enriched with metadata, for example, to be of value to those people who use it, rather than just doing a massive dump and saying, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, because otherwise we don't understand the quality of the data that's going out there either. So we can chuck huge amounts of data out there, but that's no use really if we don't understand how good or accurate the data is. So I think there's this, you know, it's far more complex than just, yes, let's just all publish it, you know, and wonderful things will happen. We need to be far more vigorous in thinking about actually what are the best mechanisms for getting information out there and providing people with those sort of that certainty around the information as well, or not. I mean, if people, as long as people understand the quality of the information, even if that's, well, it's pretty dubious, at least then they can make a decision about how much reliance they want to put on it. But the danger is that we just push a lot of data out there without that information, and then people aren't really able to use it that well, or may potentially make false judgments based upon it because they're assuming it's better than it actually is.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Julian, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah, I think actually first I'll quickly respond to Alex's point there about quality, because that was one of the areas that we discussed with Catherine Corrick this morning. And one of the issues is what's good quality data for one organisation, for one use, isn't necessarily good data for another use. And the publisher of the data doesn't necessarily know all the uses. So all they can do is they can put a quality stamp based on their perspectives, their perceptions of the data. But it's then up to the user of the data. They need to be carefully thinking about, okay, what is the quality of this data? Does it support our use case? So yeah, it was a very interesting thing that came through this morning on that. Anyway, that was replaying the this morning. So one of the questions that's come through from Tim, and he's been asking a few questions throughout this week, is open data a specific brand that is about the public having access to the data that belongs to the public collectively? Or is it more of an approach that applies to any collective activity, where open doesn't mean giving access to anybody outside the activity, but sort of removing barriers within it? So are the boundaries around this open concept? I can see John grinning there. So do you want to go first, John?
Yeah, this is a can of worms. It's there's the OGL3, which the Open Government License, which says, but that must be a definition, is it must be freely published, it must be unencumbered. Essentially, you're free to use it how you like, adapt, republish, with the only requirement being to acknowledge. But then you've got various open-ish, because they have kind of restrictive clauses like, yes, it's open, but you can't use it commercially. And then I've just seen Martin's got a CC by SA, which the Sentinel and the European Space Agency data is released under. Generally, to me, an open data means it is unencumbered. If it isn't unencumbered totally, it is not open. It's the same as open source, as in software.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, John. I think, Andy, you put a comment in the chat, and I guess you've already got some views on this as well.
Yeah, some very strong views. It's something that has me spitting feathers when I hear people claiming things are open and they're not. The open definition, which is published by the Open Knowledge Foundation on behalf of a number of organisations, says pretty much basically what John just said, unencumbered. Open means anyone can freely access, use, modify and share for any purpose, subject at most to requirements that preserve provenance and openness. So if your data or your content or your software or whatever it might be is released with something that says no commercial reuse, it is not open. If it says we reserve the right to withdraw this license at any time, it is not open. And if it says you have to pay us, it is not open. Simple as that. Open licenses include the Open Government License, the Open Parliament License, CC by SA. Those meet the open definition. Open licenses, licenses with things like CC by NC, which means non-commercial use, or CC by excuse me, ND, which means no derivatives. In other words, you can't mash up or edit this data or this content, are not open. And to me, it's a black and white issue. And the sooner that we all agree to use the most commonly used and accepted definition and stop trying to wriggle around the edges, the easier it will be for everybody to understand what we're dealing with. There's nothing wrong with releasing your data under a license that isn't open if that suits you and your data reusers. But please don't call it open if it's not.
Interesting that. I mean, Chloe, I mean, TfL have been really good exemplars of publishing a lot of the data, particularly the live transport streams. And I guess you don't necessarily know all the uses people are going to be using that. So in terms of the second part of Tim's point there in his question is that you haven't put the boundaries there, you've actually just made it available. Is that fair?
In many cases, yeah. And we leave it open. So we do make for example, journey planner algorithm open, so people can actually put that straight into their services. But we find that certainly the sort of bigger players, they take the data and they put their own algorithms on it. So they're making their own journey route suggestions, weighted how they see fit and how presumably they think they're going to get a market advantage. I think that's absolutely fine. There are some cases where perhaps consistency becomes important, and we talk about open data, and we talk sometimes about the difference in the data and the insight. And an example there would be, we publish busyness data now. I talked about it in my presentation, so apologies for people where I'm repeating myself. But essentially from the Wi-Fi data that we get in stations, we can work out, based on how busy that station ever gets, whether it's kind of, we basically have a percentage value for how busy it is compared to its usual busyness. And in our own products, we've extrapolated that out to be quiet, busy, or very busy, and that's at certain levels. Whereas we've published the data in its kind of rawer form of basically a percentage busyness, a point whatever. But then when you then think about how that gets used, when you might have people using the same or using multiple different products or services to find out the same information, and really, is that station right now going to be busy or not? And they might get different information if they use our TfL Go app, or if they use the Move It app, or if they use Google Maps. Is that going to be kind of confusing and therefore cause more problems to the consumers than if we actually had just published it as a standard? Right now, station X is busy. And everybody could just take that as open data and put it into their product, but we're consistent in terms of it. And it's something we wrestled with quite a lot, because in London, we'd like it to be consistent, and I'd really like to give that same information out. But you also have to understand that these other products are often not just London based, and they're going to want some consistency across their whole, all of the markets that they operate in. And so for them, being able to fit it in with whatever they've sort of determined is really important. So at the moment we do it where it is there as it's open, but we have a conversation with them and try and encourage them where appropriate to be to be consistent with the language and the thresholds that we use. And that feels like the right balance at the moment.
That's good, thank you. And Alex, any thoughts from you about this, whether it's the collective public good, but also this issue about, is it just this boundaries around who can do what with the data, and therefore it's not fully open?
Yeah, I mean, the definition of open data is pretty clear. I mean, I don't think anybody could really argue with that. I mean, with government itself have published what they regard as open data, the requirements around what is open, and it is absolutely this, uncontrolled access. You can take it. You don't have to register. You can use it for any purpose, etc., etc. So, I mean, I don't think there's any debate over that. I think my point is more around, you need to decide whether you want to make something open or not, and understand the true implications of making information open. And if there are aspects of that you are uncomfortable with, particularly obviously as far as I'm concerned from a security perspective, then you make sure that you don't make that part of the data open. But yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any debate. Well, I personally don't think there's any debate about what is regarded as open data or not.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, do you want to pick up the next one?
Yeah, sure. I think we'll take Martin Newman's question next. So Martin asks, what do members of the panel think will be the impact of the National Lottery Heritage Fund's new policy on making CC the default position for projects they fund, and recommendations on open licensing from towards a national collection report, A Culture of Copyright, a scoping study on open access to digital cultural heritage in the UK? And we'll go to Andy first, followed by Chloe.
I think the National Lottery Heritage Funds move is excellent. And indeed, it's something I've been lobbying them for several years. In a moment, I'll pop a blog post that I wrote some years ago about this very issue and why it should be one of their criteria for funding. In fact, it was 2015 when I wrote it, 30th of June, so almost exactly 7 years ago. I'll pop that into the chat. But it's an excellent move. I'm really pleased with it. There is a little wriggle room in that they say if this is difficult for an organisation, they can ask for an exception. And we've yet to see who will ask for an exception and how many will be granted. And there hasn't been much publicity yet about the open content that's been produced as a result of this change in their policy, although I'm sure that will come. But no, it is absolutely a marvellous move. I'm really, really pleased to see it. Long overdue, but still an excellent move. Similarly, the work that Andrea's been doing with the towards a national collection report in her report, A Culture of Copyright, is also excellent. She's pretty much arguing for the same sort of thing across the arts and galleries and museum sector. And she's looking at this issue of whether digitizing an out of copyright work, like a painting by John Constable or a drawing by Van Gogh or whatever it might be, or the works of Shakespeare or whatever you like, whether simply digitizing those works creates a new copyright. And there are people in museums and galleries and other organizations who argue that it does, or who act as though it does, whether perhaps they know deep down inside that it actually doesn't. And the part of the problem is there isn't actual case law in the UK because there's never been a court case about it. But there is clear guidance from the UK's Intellectual Property Office that simply digitising something doesn't create a new copyright. And European law, and of course we're yet to see how far we'll move away from European law as a result of Brexit, but European law says there is no new copyright created if you digitise something. And in America, and indeed a large part of the world, no new copyright is created when you digitize something. So I think anybody who pretends or claims that there is a new copyright is on very shaky grounds. And some of the culprits identified in this Culture of Copyright report are some of the big museums and galleries, people like Tate and, make sure I get this right, the National Portrait Gallery are doing it. And I think it's shameful. It's doubly shameful because they're doing it with public money and because they're charitable institutions whose founding documents say they will make things available to the public. And I think the act of saying, well, no, you can't have that digitally, even though we've digitized it already, or you can't have it unless you pay us a big wodge of money, quite often a very unrealistic sum of money, goes against those charter documents that have actually allowed them to exist and to become charitable organizations. And it's interesting that Martin asked this, because I know Martin is very sympathetic to what I'm saying and the general points of it, or at least I believe he is from the comments I've seen him make in the sessions this week and elsewhere. But the organization he works for is one of the culprits, I'm afraid. And they recently told me that I couldn't have a set of out of copyright aerial photographs taken by the RAF. Now these, because they were taken by the RAF, were Crown copyright. So their copyright expired 70 years after they were, sorry, their copyright expired if they were taken up before 1957, 70 years after they were taken. And there are something of the order of 38,000 aerial images of Britain, which they've digitized. And they told me I couldn't have them under freedom of information because they are available to me commercially. And to buy each of those individual images commercially in total would cost over £500,000. Now, those images were taken with public money. They were digitized with public money. Their copyright has expired. In other words, the exclusion to the right of everybody to copy them, which applied under Crown copyright until 70 years had passed, is now up. And so we all have the legal right to copy those, but this organization are sitting on them and refusing to let people have easy access to them. They use some software on their website which prevents you from downloading them. And the purveyors of the software talk about image theft and people stealing content. Well, you can't steal something that already belongs to you. And this is another example of what we saw 200 or 300 years ago with the enclosure of the commons. It's the digital commons that's being enclosed. I'm beginning to rant a little bit. As you can tell, it's another issue that grinds my gears, and something I feel very strongly about. But I will pop a link. I see somebody's already popped a link to the actual report in the chat. I'll pop a link into an hour-long YouTube video where Andrea, who wrote it, did a presentation for another event I was at recently, which is also worth watching if anybody's interested. And I'm happy to expand on my points at greater length if anybody wants to talk to me after this event.
Okay, so thank you to Martin for planting a question that seems to be designed for you, Andy.
Yeah, it wasn't any collusion. It was pure chance.
Pure chance. Okay. So Chloe, you're next, and then we'll go to Alex.
So I have to say I know nothing about this National Lottery open data requirement, so I can't really comment on that. But I did want to pick up on what Andy was saying around the kind of free access. So we make all of our data, our open data, available for free. At the moment, obviously, it's not to consumers, it's to third parties. But our reading of like the kind of the open data I guess principles or rules is that it's not unreasonable to charge a fee, but it's about it being proportionate, because obviously there are costs involved in producing, maintaining, distributing that data, and that that is something that certain organisations opt to do, and there are, I think, examples, and I'm sure Andy can refute all of this, but yeah, like things like I think the Met Office do have a charging model, and it's not a lot per kind of organisation. I think it's not for public sector, but yeah, there are places where the data is open, but there is a charge to access. So I don't know, from where I'm coming from, it doesn't seem quite so black and white as it all must be absolutely free.
It's a shame we haven't got Lisa Allen on from the ODI, because one of the comments she made in the email exchange we had before the panel debate was she thinks that there are cases where open data can be, there is a case for charging for access to open data, but it'd be interesting if to hear her contribution to this. So Alex next, and then John, please.
I don't think, I mean, again, it's not something I'm hugely familiar with. I've just had a very, very quick scan through the article that was posted. So I mean, I don't know enough about it to really comment. So I'm gonna pass, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's perfectly reasonable. John, would you have any thoughts or comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add anything to what Andy said, because I'm in 100% agreement with him. I do think a move to CC. The thing that I found when you get this issue about, it's not the fact that the images are out of copyright, but it's the trying to claim database right. So it's saying, well, we've scanned them, therefore we have the database right, rather than, and this is a bit like the path. It's database right that they stick on, not copyright. That's the issue. On the issue of charging, I mean, I'm aware there seems to be two charging models. Some organizations charge if you want the data on physical media, which is perfectly reasonable. And quite a lot, though, I mean, Met Office being one, Ordnance Survey, are what I would call freemium models. So up to a certain level or a certain granularity, the data is free. Once you actually want more detailed data, then there's a charge. So that is sort of where I see it, and that's where it's reasonable to charge. But OS, there's a lot free. Met Office, there's a lot free. It's what Met Office don't, what sort of Ordnance Survey, for example, don't want to do is every architect to get their full master map free of charge that they can just sell to clients, because that's really a commercial thing. Whereas the overview maps and making maps for election results and things like that, that data is all free, the boundary line, etc. So I don't mind I wouldn't say charging for open data, charging for data. So the freemium model of having a certain level open and then a certain level above that that's chargeable is quite common. And I think it's quite reasonable because there are costs involved.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. So just moving on there. So another area to explore really is that we've got in a situation where the number of open data sets is growing considerably. So how we actually ensure that the right ones are found and can be trusted. And if we take the example building on Andy's point there about aerial imagery, it may well be that an aerial survey data or any kind of survey data was taken this year and published, I don't know, 1st of January. There may be a similar data set that's been published on the 1st of June, but actually relates to a survey that was done 5 years ago. So although the date of publication may imply it's a more recent survey, the reality may be far different to that. So how do we know which data sets to trust, particularly as the data sets are starting to grow kind of exponentially? Probably John first and then Andy, I think.
I mean, as data sets grow exponentially, then we're crossing really from open data into the open source. And I think we talk very much in this whole conference being about open data, but alongside this, there's been a huge development in an open data analytics community. One of the things being Apache Arrow, which is a totally open source foundation that you can actually now deal with big data on your laptop. There are tools that take you beyond Excel and they're freely available. There's QGIS. Used to pay a fortune for ArcGIS. Now you've got the totally free GIS system, QGIS. You've got Octave, which is a MATLAB clone. You've got a RStudio statistical packages. So you've actually got free of charge. So I always think that dealing with the exponential growth is that the open source software sits alongside it and it's an ecosystem. So open data feeds into that ecosystem, because I couldn't process satellite data without having the tools to do it. And all of those tools are open source. ESA published their own software to process their data, but there are also third parties that open source libraries, for example, GDAL, the Geographic Data Abstraction Library, where you can process satellite imagery. So I see it as transport being a good example. You've got graph analytics, you've got Network X, and you've got NVIDIA's Rapids, which does very fast graph analytics, single source, shortest path, rerouting, congestion points. So all of the things you would get in any type of network, not just transport, utilities network or anything else, you're looking at the particular where the bottlenecks are, where the problems are, rerouting, shortest path. So I would say that it's the software ecosystem alongside the data ecosystem that will support this expansion.
But the question also was really looking at the sheer number of data sets, not just the size of those data sets. So if, I don't know, 5 times the number of organizations publish 5 times the number of data sets per year, the volume we've got grows significantly. And how do we make sense of that and work out which are the best ones to trust?
I think it's what I made in a point I made in my talk, that it's a shame that data.gov.uk is not better than it is, and it's not it's meant to be a signpost to all open data. It uses CCAN under the bonnet, which is a bit dated now, to be honest. There are far better metadata repositories. I mean, OS behind their open data portal, the new one, have an API, so you can actually go and query their catalog. So they have RESTful APIs. And I would like to see more APIs that say, what have you got? Rather than me having to trail through websites, I can actually programmatically search for what I want with sort of RESTful queries in JSON. So I think it's actually the signposting is the thing that needs to improve, rather than the actual data.
Okay, thank you, John. Yeah, Andy, thoughts from you?
Yeah, again, pretty much in agreement. I don't know anybody who's said, I have too much open data, I wish people would stop publishing it. And I think we're a very long way before that ever does happen. There are an awful lot of books and journal articles published, but nobody says that we shouldn't have them. We rely on reviews and word of mouth and aggregators to find the things that are useful. We look at who's citing who. in order to find the original source documents. You do the same with your data. Even if open data sets don't require attribution, it's good practice to say which data you used in your products or your aggregated data, so that people who are using it can go back to the source data and know that it's reliable and of value. So I think we need to apply those sorts of skills, and I think perhaps those skills are evolving. It's still a very new thing for a lot of people. Coming back to the issue that we talked about earlier about maturity and whether we're there yet. I know a few college and university courses that are teaching journalists and computer scientists to investigate data and to interpret data and to find and to evaluate data in terms of its quality. We need more of that. I mean, it's a pretty poor news service these days that doesn't employ a data journalist.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Alex, in terms of part of the question was really about trust, and I think there's probably two aspects to that. One is that somebody may have inadvertently published something that you've got a concern about, but more the other area that you could, if somebody's being malicious, they could publish something that's pseudo-open, but they've actually skewed the data to try and achieve a particular outcome. So it's actually not a trustworthy source because somebody's messed around with it. Any thoughts about how we might be able to work around that? Is it realistic?
Yes, I mean, I think it's around what a trust. I mean, you know, could we get to the point of having a trusted platform where actually there are requirements that you have to go through in order to be able to share information through them? I think I would love it if we were very good at picking out information and saying that's rubbish and that's not. But I mean, I think if anything, the amount of stuff that is published, I was going to use another word, on social media and how much people just take what's out there and, oh, well, it's on TikTok or whatever the latest thing is, and therefore it must be true. And actually there's a real issue, I think, you know, with something on the radio the other day talking about a number of young people now actually just taking the source of their news is TikTok rather than, you know, maybe a slightly more reliable source. So I think there is a real issue that we are not very good at actually applying that vigor to the information. And I think the danger is the more and more information we put out there. I'm not saying this isn't the reason why we shouldn't publish data, but we get into this sort of huge data soup of, you know, where, you know, it's really difficult to pick out what is genuine or what is good and what is not. And I think, you know, unless you can get to the point of actually saying, are there better ways of applying things around that data that's being made open, I'm not sure you can actually address it. It's going to be down to individuals to actually try and apply that figure to it.
Yeah, so some ongoing challenges there. And Chloe, in terms of in the transport sector, I think people seem to be quite innovative about how they're using these data sets, but there's potentially a risk there that there's a data set that could add value, but somebody's missed it because of the sheer number of data sets that are being published.
Yeah, I think sort of from us personally, I guess quite often it's the type of data that only we can provide. So it's not about there's like, you know, hundreds of different versions of the same potential piece of information and which one's either accurate or right. You know, it's the data they get straight from us. So I think it's more, picking up on John's point around signposting, and so being really clear in the documentation about what the data is, how you can use it, you know, any limitations that there might be. And we've been we've got mixed success in terms of being able to do that signposting correctly, and we also have people who can then answer questions and help people find the data that they need. But yeah, I'm sure there are instances where there's people who want to use the data who just either don't know it's there or aren't quite clear on how it's used yet.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe. Just a quick comment that Martin's raised in the chat, or to a point raised earlier before I hand back across to Mark. So this comment that John made about database rights, so Martin's commented view that you should only be able to claim database rights if you created something that is new and different to some of its components. So that isn't really a valid argument, the same as if you make a faithful digital facsimile of something. So Martin's got a very clear view on that.
It's what I said the other day, that unfortunately these are the arguments put forward, and unless the only court case surrounding open data has been 77M versus Ordnance Survey, unless you actually get these things in court which one day I could see possibly the open addresses thing ending up in court, that you will not get a definition. There was the thing about the 77M case is the judge cleared up what is derived work. He came up with definition. So that is now in case law. So a lot of things were established. And one interesting thing was that open data, if you scrape and the website T's and C's say explicitly you can't scrape, you have not acquired that data within the T's and C's. Therefore, you have not acquired a license. So OGL does not apply. That data is unlicensed. That is one of the things that's in it. So it is still, there are quite a few legal gray areas. I'm not a lawyer at all, but I mean, the ODI has actually got legal counsel and they've looked into these. It's a shame Lisa couldn't be here because the ODI have put a lot of effort into the legal side, particularly. So I don't know, Andy, have you got any thoughts beyond that?
Well, I just said here. I thought Martin was absolutely spot on. Case law or otherwise, Parliament deciding to clear it up without a case. Yeah. But I can't see that happening for quite some time.
No.
Great. Just looking at the clock, I think we've rattled through most of the hours. So I think we've just got time for one more question. So I'm going to change the topic slightly. And a favourite topic for any data conference is what are the job opportunities? So I'm going to ask the panel if, especially for someone, at the younger end of their career, starting out, looking at open data, what do you think the future holds in terms of career opportunities around or within or next to open data? And we will start with Alex, then go to John.
I think that, well, it's not strictly speaking open data, but I think there is going to be huge opportunities in that whole space around how we manage information going forwards. And we're seeing so much, such an increasing use of digitalization and technologies that produce information. I think there's going to be some really exciting opportunities in that sort of space around that management of information, and clearly that obviously ties in with the open data space. And there'll also be a lot about people that are seeking to exploit information that's been published, and some of the innovation that will come in around taking that information and doing things with it, as long as we can find the decent information in amongst everything that's maybe not so decent.
Okay, great. John, and then Chloe.
Yeah, well, I have to admit I'm biased. I work in a university lab, and we actually do an MSc and PhD in geographic data science, and a lot of that is around open data. We have an input of 20 every year postgrads. We've been running for 7 years. Our postgrads are never out of work. Our students are never out of work. They are snapped up. And actually, a lot of them are sponsored. So quite a lot of our projects that are done within the lab are sponsored. TfL has sponsored one, commercial, shop, retailers, ONS, OS. So we do have quite, so I think from an academic point of view, open data opens up great opportunities for researchers within academia and ancillary. So we've got postdocs working on satellite projects, but also we're seeing this startup ecosystem around open data, but you've just got to make sure the problem with open data is that your clients don't expect the service for free. It's because your business model will fail if you are purely funding it, unless you're part of a foundation, charitable foundation, which some organizations are. You need to have some kind of revenue to pay your staff. So looking at startups, there's quite a lot of startups around the climate change, and they're working very much with open data. There's companies who have interpreted the Met Office models to, for example, a company called Ambiental has taken the Met Office models, but it has actually then used other data, land registry data and other things to actually apply it, to create flood scores for each property. So there are again, it's come back to this freemium. model. So I think job opportunities there are quite significant in research areas, and I know within a lot of retail organisations, you're actually. I'd like to ask Chloe, when you come to your turn, are you actually a consumer of open data within TfL as well? So, say for example, OS data and other data in some of your research. So yeah,
a nice segue there for you, Chloe.
Yeah.
So yeah, we definitely bring in other data sets that we haven't produced, and sometimes we then package them up before pushing them out, and sometimes they just sort of go straight there. So we've got air pollution data through our open data service, because that kind of goes alongside sort of transport data, and we talked about EV charging earlier, and that's an aggregation of feeds that have come in from various operators. So there are examples where we're taking data in and sort of processing it ourselves. In terms of, I think, I very much agree with that whole thing about the academic research, and within TfL we support both at like an educational level, so trying to get people interested in it, running sort of schools sort of based activities. To be fair, I'm not sure we've done so much since the pandemic in that sort of space, but also definitely sort of university research. We get a lot of requests coming in. We had a lot of requests coming in that were sort of slightly outside of the open data, wanting travel information, and the travel patterns that we saw during the pandemic, and how certain factors were changing that. So we were sort of providing that, and actually got to the point of creating some reports so that we weren't having to sort of do it on an ad hoc basis, and that then can be embellished with it runs alongside the sort of open data sets that's available to everyone, that that they can then take away and do what they need to do. In the past, we've done partnerships with the MIT over in Massachusetts. So yeah, there's definitely space there. Thinking about sort of startups, it used to be a big space, and it's one of the reasons that we started doing open data, was to kind of help the industry, help the London sort of economy by supporting other businesses. Feels like in the transport space it's quite dominated at the moment by a few big players, but that's not to say we might not have another wave, particularly as sort of micro-mobility and those sorts of mass services come along. We started seeing some players emerge there, and they're obviously all using our open data alongside other sources. So yeah, quite a lot going on.
Great. So Andy, what do you see in terms of career opportunities in or around or next to open data?
Well, I'm disappointed, because when you spoke about early career, I thought you were going to come to me first. No, seriously, it's a long time since I was in that position. I wish I was starting over. It'd be marvelous to have all this ahead of you. I've already mentioned data journalism, which I think is going to be a growing area. My career was traditional one until 10 years ago, and then I went freelance, and I've been consulting ever since. And I think there'll be a lot more of that. I think we're seeing it generally anyway, but people having portfolio careers, doing a bit of this and a bit of that, it's going to be, so it makes it sound very trivial, but getting involved in different pieces of work over different periods of time is going to be increasingly common. And I think the open data and open content worlds will be a major player in that. As obviously will be remote and mobile working and internet technologies generally. But having said that, I think some of the big traditional industries are going to be using open data and employing people to understand open data, to analyze it, to produce it, to do what Alex has been talking about, to sort of check it for sanity and safety before it's published. So I think right across all types of careers, or rather all types of work, there will be openings for people working with data, and particularly with open data. It's going to be a growing area for quite some time.
Thank you. Julian.
Yes, so thank you. So I think we're about out of time now. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our 4 panelists, John, Andy, Chloe and Alex. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you to you as an audience for taking part. And if you've been following us throughout the week, there have been a number I know who have attended quite a few of these webinars. I hope you enjoyed it, got some real value out of it. As mentioned before, the recordings appearing on the BCS member group's YouTube channel. That's normally takes a couple of weeks, but that does give you a chance to sort of catch up later if there's one that you've missed. And on behalf of Mark at DAMA, myself at the BCS Data Management Specialist Group, thank you. We hope to see you again at one of our future events. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all.